As I say, you can probably do it in about 2 hours. In Japan, where they have a lot more free time each week, so most Japanese teachers will probably have a timetable of about 16 hours a week, they will actually spend upwards of 20 hours. Looks go between the room. They will spend up to 20 hours planning a single lesson, which, I don't know about you, but I probably want to gouge my eyes out with rusty spoons by the end of that. But what they're doing is their planning goes down to the level of, like, we're going to introduce it this way. This is the first question we ask. If we ask this question, they may give us one of 3 answers. For each of those 3 answers, what is our response to the next question we're going to do? So they plan it down to the end. I've actually seen some translated Japanese lesson plans. They run to about 15 sites for a single 60-minute lesson. It's just phenomenal. I mean, I just lose it. I just wouldn't be able to do it.
Do they refer to it?
Yeah. The other thing in Japan is what we have found is that we think when people start with lesson study, actually probably one of the best sizes is a tryout, is to use 3 people. Many more, and it gets a bit unwieldy. 2, you're not getting enough ideas. So you'd normally have 2 observers per lesson. I've seen photographs in Japan of anything upwards of 18 or 20 people observing a class of 30 kids. Because you've got all these adults just stood around the corner with a cup of beer. And the kids are just, because the kids are used to it, they think, yeah, whatever. You then teach the lesson, and obviously the big difference with lesson study is that actually you're observing the kids, you're not observing the teacher. So quite often what you'll see in a lesson study observation is people who are observing are either sitting at the side or the corner at the front, not at the back. Because obviously if you sit at the back, you can see in the back of a load of people's heads, it's not particularly useful. So the idea is you look at your students, you think, you look at the predictions you've made about their learning, and you do almost like a comparative observation. What do we think? What are they actually doing? What evidence is there? You could write down particular quotes. It's where solo taxonomy can come in as well, actually, in the sense that if you think of relational as using connected language, one of the things you can do is when you're listening to them speak is, are they connecting ideas together in their talk? Or are they just giving various bits of information? You can actually, if you want to, use solo taxonomy as almost an observational framework. Could work that way, I guess. We have used it a bit like that. At the end of the lesson, the basic model is that the teachers then come back together and they evaluate the evidence from the observation, try to work out how well they think it's worked, whether or not the students have moved on, and then what you can do is if you think there are parts of the lesson that could be better, you can amend the lesson plan and then teach it to a parallel group if there's another one who will be having the same lesson that haven't been taught yet. Okay? There are ways of embellishing it. So one of the things that we do as standard, and a lot of the schools that we work with do wherever possible now, is that we will do a brief interview with the people that we've observed afterwards. And what we'll ask them to do, we'll do 2 things. We'll take photocopies of the work they've done during the lesson, so we can look at artefacts of their learning as part of the evaluation. And then what we actually do is we do a thing called stimulated recall interviewing. So we sit them down with their book and the resources they've used and say, right, let's go through the lesson. What were you thinking at this point? Why did you write that down? Why have you put that as your answer? What was going through your mind? So it's incomplete still, but you're beginning to open up from their memory, and therefore it's better, the sooner you do it after the end of the lesson, the better. You're beginning to open up an idea of the process they were actually going through in the lesson.
But it's also making them aware then of that metacognitive process. Yeah.
What is really interesting is that you then begin to pick up just how inaccurate observation is. I've had a whole stack of teachers, I've done it myself, with stuff we've done with master's students, where you observe and think one thing's going on, and then when you talk to them, something completely different is going on, because you haven't had access inside their heads. So I can remember a guy I've been doing, he's a head of geography in the city. I've been doing research with him for about 7 or 8 years now. Senior teacher, brilliant guy, absolutely student focused. I did an interview with him after he'd done a couple of cycles of this with a PGCE student that he was working with, and he just sort of sat there and said, this is brilliant, but I'm going to have to take a couple of weeks to sit down and work out what I do with it. Because I thought this was going on in my lessons. This suggests that there's a whole series of things going on in my lessons, and how do I begin to assimilate some of this? You know, the kind of journeys that kids take through lessons. The other thing you can do, if you've got the time and the information, we've got a paper coming out next year, hopefully, on this with some students we work with, is actually what we call participatory lesson study. So before we have the meeting to plan the lesson, rather than assuming we know what the problem is and the challenge is, we actually talk to a group of students first. And once we've worked out what the problem is, we'll say to them, and how do you think we could best help you learn that? What's the block and what kind of things might help? And then take that information into the planning meeting. And then after the meeting, sit down with them again and say, well, did it work? How'd it go? Yeah.
Have you looked into sort of micro-narrative